Hello there and welcome to AM Prime on WESN Content Capital. I'm Keaton Shaw. Thank you very much for joining me for this edition of the program. Well, this morning within our first hour, we're speaking about the environment. Our first conversation actually focuses on Trinidad and Tobago's energy transition following the COP28 summit. In fact, what happened at COP28, many of us are aware of what happens there in regards to climate financing, and climate conversations. And it's always rather difficult. A lot is happening over the course of this summit, over the course of days, negotiations and agreements. However, we don't know all the details. But in regards to Trinidad and Tobago's position and what has happened following COP28, an individual who is best probably to explain that to us and to further the conversation. He is a PhD candidate and teaching associate at the Department of English at the University of Massachusetts, Mr. Jarrel De Matas, and he is with me in studio this morning. Good morning. Welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me,
How are you doing? Season's greetings.
Season's greetings to you.
Well, in the midst of all the Christmas celebrations, or as they were really beginning, COP28 took place, and many of us were asleep actually while that was happening because it was taking place in Abu Dhabi.
Yeah.
However, significant agreements to come out of this. Really, if you can give us a summary of COP28.
Yeah, sure. So let me begin by saying climate summits have a bad rep because they're conceived as all talk, no action. But COP28 was significant, relatively significant, for the fact that it actually delivered on at least two things, which I cover in my recent column. One of those things is the Loss and Damage Fund. Now, that requires governments with more advanced economies to contribute to a fund to help vulnerable countries, such as our own, deal with the effects of climate change. Now, that Loss and Damage Fund is difficult in itself because it attempts to quantify something that is inherently unable to quantify. Like, how do we, for example, the cocoa industry, how do we put a number? How do we track that extent of damage then, right? So the Loss and Damage Fund was problematic to begin with, but it at least got started at COP28. And a few countries pledged up to about 800 million US. And it seems like a lot, but it's actually quite a drop in the bucket when we think about the extent of climate change and the impacts of it. So that was the first thing, the Loss and Damage Fund. The second major thing was they finally agreed on a language with which to describe the move away from fossil fuels. Now, we know that fossil fuel exploration is one of the main drivers of climate crisis. And the sort of transition away, as they call it, where they put a language to fossil fuel, moving away from fossil fuels. And they wanted stronger languages such as phase out, but they actually agreed on transition away instead. So again, a bit vague, but it at least was something that they could finally agree on.
Which is interesting because that was the peak conversation from COP28. Yeah. Agreeing that deal, the jargon, the language that was being used was heavily debated over the last couple of days, so much so that there were thoughts at one point that a deal was not going to happen, it was going to collapse.
Yeah. And this fuels like the bad reputation, right? Like, because there are conflicting interests on so many different levels. I mean, it's sort of summed up in the actual COP28 president, Sultan Al Jaber, who is, get this, he's the president of COP28, special envoy to climate change, but he's also the CEO of the national oil company. So it's that sort of conflict of interest that kind of it reveals itself in how to actually find a language then, because at some point you're going to be sort of selling out, right? And it's going to affect the profits, in this case from Sultan Al Jaber, who has a very, very vested interest in oil, but also has to wear the hat of climate change. So I think it's also an important thing is getting the right people in those positions, and I don't feel that Sultan Al Jaber is the right person.
That's the thing. These contrasting, stark contrast, you have an individual who is basically the head of a major oil company, a major global oil company, and also the president of one of the biggest, if not the biggest, climate pact, globally. The thing is that does that only add to people not taking it seriously? People saying it's a complete waste of time.
Yeah, and I think it's, yes, I think it's also acknowledging those limitations. Like climate, like environmental action has money in it as well, right? So it's also satisfying that sort of, that conflict of interest where you can sort of gain a reputation or gain fame from being the COP28 president, being the face of the major climate summit in a sense. So yes, that absolutely is a problem. There's also something to be said, I think, about the people on the ground and, small communities, small organizations doing the work. Like I've been doing work for Climate Tracker, which is an NGO throughout the world, actually, but I'm part of the Caribbean contingent. So we're also very much questioning these systems of power as well. And also just like being here talking about it, like, I don't know how many of your viewers would know that, salt and algebra, for example, had that sort of duality. And I think it's sort of like, if you were to think about our Trinidad and Tobago context, like, we're trying to do both things, and it's conflicting as well.
Yes, it is rather conflicting because again, another contrast is that while COP28 was happening, Prime Minister Dr. Rowley, with good intention, was in London signing a new agreement with major oil companies. Before we get to that, though, I think one of the things that really struck most people who followed COP28, and if I'm being honest with you, I don't think many Trinbagonians followed COP28, which is why it's important to have such conversations, is that the Sultan made a claim about a lack of science that does not support the theory that reducing or the phasing out of fossil fuels exploration, drilling, consumption would help with our targets of 1.5 degrees Celsius. The world is getting warmer. He made that statement, which was interesting because that actually goes against what scientists and the United Nations has been preaching to the globe for the last few years in particular.
And to go back to COP27, Prime Minister Mia Mottley in Barbados said like 1.5, that's it. If we cross 1.5, we're pretty much doomed. And I know this is probably not the best way to start the day, so I apologize to your viewers. But this is where we're at. And his comments before COP28 just sort of revealed what we already know about his conflict of interests, because the International Environmental Agency, the IEA, had already said, like, we need to reduce fossil fuel exploration, gas, which includes LNG, by the way, by these percentages in order to keep it to 1.5. Like, the 1.5 is actually inevitable. So it's really just a matter of damage control at this point.
Damage control. Okay, so let's get into Trinidad and Tobago focus. We are a small island developing state. We are very much vulnerable to the effects of climate change. We are already experiencing such. The cocoa industry is experiencing that. The plants are actually suffering extremely from the weather conditions that have changed so dramatically. Even our coastlines, we're seeing coastal erosion at quite a phenomenal rate. That being said, we've taken a position where the Minister of Energy, Stuart Young, has said, we're going to extract every single ounce of fossil fuels, so as long as we can. But at the same time, we're also pushing for some sort of compensation or some sort of help or aid, given our position as a small island developing state. We're going down a rather sticky path, aren't we?
Yeah. And let me just say, to rely on this loss and damage fund is something that I think is dangerous, because for a couple of reasons. Now, around the loss and damage fund, there was a problem of who's going to host this money, who's going to hold the money, right? And there was sort of trepidation around the World Bank for kind of obvious reasons, like it's held in a reserve, it typically runs on loans, so it further indebts nations. And we're still not clear who is going to be getting this money. So to rely on the loss and damage fund to begin with is something that I don't think we should really be considering at this point. But to your point about this sticky path, like we talk about the future of energy, and that was one of the things that came out of the restructuring deal, the Atlantic LNG deal that you mentioned in London. We talk about the future of a sustainable energy future, but we're not really talking about our climate future. And I think that lends itself to the fact that we're noticing these things happening around us. The cocoa industry, for example, we're noticing lower yields, and we're also noticing that farmers are having difficulty like sustaining their own livelihoods, right? Like, so the loss and damage, it also attempts to help communities with their livelihoods and those impacts as well, which is also difficult to quantify. So it's that sticky path, like you mentioned, like where's our attention really? And you know, I'm actually at the point where I'm wondering, can we actually do both? Like, we're wedded to energy, unfortunately. That is the deal that we've been, that's the hand that we've been dealt. And now I'm wondering, like, can we do both in a sense? Can we from that profit to be had from those energy deals, can we direct that into a sustainable climate pattern?
And that is the thing. I mean, you said it yourself. We're wedded to energy.
Yeah.
The thing is that I will say that our interest in terms of, green energy, or even in the sense of diversification, has been rather poor. It has been. Yes, we are wedded to energy. Our economy is reliant on such.
Yeah.
But the thing is, at the same time, whilst we can't afford to move away from energy at this point, we also can't afford to deal with the effects of climate change.
Yeah.
Is there any sort of transition that we can look at that will be inclusive of all factors?
Yeah, and this is the one of the talking points also of COP28. Like it's what's being called a just transition, which is a future that is inclusive, that kind of satisfies everyone, everyone's interest. Now that is inherently difficult to do. Nonetheless, in that just transition, there's also talk about how we're going to move away, how are we going to create sustainable energy forms. And I think one of those things to consider would be a national roadmap, like setting specific milestones along the way. And it's also important to have accountability. But now, accountability requires good governance. So we need to find the right people, right? We can't have algebras in the positions, right? We need to have people who are committed to climate change and actually not, who don't have conflicts of interest in energy or in non-renewable energy, I should say.
The thing is that also if we take a look at TNT, the argument anyone is going to make to you, Jarrel, is simple. We're looking at LNG. Yeah. We're focusing a lot more on LNG. It's a cleaner form of fuel. Yeah. Is that just?
So LNG, that is very misleading because we talk about it as cleaner. It's only cleaner compared to oil because the fact is that methane emissions from LNG are actually up to 80% warmer than carbon dioxide. So it's actually more dangerous. And let me tell you this, and for your viewers, now, in 2022, we were the fourth largest producer of methane emissions, right? So those emissions that we're unable to contain, and per capita, I should say, right? So we're creating a big impact. And back to the loss and damage fund, it's even questionable if we can call ourselves a vulnerable country because the amount of emissions that we're producing, we are on par with some of the global nations. So should we really be looking to the loss and damage fund? Would they really consider Trinidad?
Well, that's the thing. So we're even in jeopardy already in regards to that because of our own actions.
Yeah.
Well, that is quite amazing, isn't it?
Yeah.
Because the other big factor in recent times has been climate financing. How do smaller underdeveloped nations actually get some sort of financing for green energy or a transition away? Solar farms has been explored. We see what's happening already in TNT with regards to solar farms. But there's also wind energy and the potential for that.
Yeah.
The thing is, are we also putting ourselves in a position where we might actually fall victim to that climate financing conversation, that debate where, you know what, TNT, you're not taking this seriously.
Yeah, and that's the real problem, right? Like, and that's why I said I don't think we can rely on this loss and damage fund. We don't even know when funds are going to be distributed, and so I think one of the major focus has to be how can we sort of redirect the profits to be had or supposedly to be had from deals like the Atlantic LNG restructuring agreement. How can we get funds from that and channel that into a sustainable green energy project, actually sustainable? You talk about wind energy, that requires a lot of investment. And then there's the question of foreign exchange. Like if we bring investors who are doing that wind energy infrastructure, they're not going to want to be paid in Trinidad dollars. And we have a forex problem. We've been having it for quite some time.
Jarrel, you've hit so many. We've gone in so many. It's very easy to expand this conversation and elaborate it. But going into 2024, and I know that at the end of every year you said, you know what, this year wasn't so great, you know, maybe next year.
Yeah.
It's easy to see that. In fact, it's always easy to make these promises or, as they say, resolutions. But it really doesn't matter unless action is initiated. Are you seeing any efforts at all?
So yes, in some areas. Now, the NCCP, which is our National Climate Change Policy, it was created in 2011. It was only recently updated in 2022, and it's before cabinet. It's waiting for approval, like I suppose many things. Now we need this approved, right? Because we're already lagging behind the advancements of COP28. So we need those stakeholders who have the document in front of you, please. You need to get this through because we need to update it. So that's the first thing, right? We need that NCCP document through because that can help us devise a sustainable national roadmap, which could then include renewable forms of energy. We also need aspects of that. We need some harmonization between the oil exploration and gas exploration deals into that climate change plan. So what are the profits that we're actually having? We need to be transparent about this dragon gas deal that's been touted about. And therefore, how that profit is going to be distributed, and can it be distributed? Can there be something worked out by way of allowing us to use some of that money and work on a renewable energy infrastructure in the meanwhile? So I think those two things, it does bode well for us if we can get it right, and we need the right people in those positions.
But TNT also finds itself in the position, as much as their efforts that you've just mentioned, we're not very much different, it seems, to the Sultan of Javari, because we are still we have strong interest in oil and gas. So exactly what are we advocating for? That is the confusing part, isn't it?
Yeah. And this is where if the government isn't able to do this kind of work, like we need to empower small organizations. We need NGOs to get funds to do this kind of work, to do this kind of advocacy, to lobby international organizations on behalf of Trinidad, because I don't think we can rely on the Ministry of Energy, at least.
Well, I would take it one step further. I don't think we could even rely on the EMA, but then again. Jarrel, thank you so much for your time this morning.
Thank you.
There's so much. I mean, your column actually mentioned a lot, but I'm so glad we were able to have this conversation and expand this a bit further.
Yes.
And should we make progress or should we take steps backwards, you'll see yourself in the seat once more in 2024.
Hopefully I'll have better things to say.
Hopefully. But thank you very much for your time and all the best in the year ahead.
Same to you.
Take care. All right, ladies and gentlemen, well, there you have it. Now you have an understanding of exactly what COP28 precisely was, what happened there and the negotiations to deal. Simple things such as the jargon in these agreements, the language that is used, could actually mean the difference between progress and, well, the world just having one more argument against each other. But TNT finds itself in a very difficult position by our own doing in many instances. However, what is the roadmap ahead? And that's exactly what Jarrel was questioning this morning, and he certainly has opened up my mind, and I know he's opened up your mind to a lot more. We take a break on AM Prime, and when we return, like I said, this hour this morning is dedicated to nature. We're going to speak to someone who refers to themselves as a professional bushman. We'll be right back after this.